have in artificial contraception, you don't have to have abortion, you don't have to have any of these hideous methods of interfering with the natural process of procreation. All you have to do is raise the standard of living of the poorest, and the population of the world will stabilize all by itself without the need for any policies to make it do so. This infuriates the UN, of course, which has an enormous anti-population division. But it is nevertheless the truth, and any decent demographer will tell you this. And so what I would argue for, therefore, is that the last thing you want to do, if you want to stabilize the population by making it wealthy, is to tell poorer countries like China or India that they can't burn fossil fuels to produce CO2, because it's in the burning of fossil fuels that you can generate electricity more cheaply and more conveniently and more reliably in a third world country than by any other method. And if you take that right away from the poorer countries, you imprison them in poverty, you therefore cause a continuing increase in a population which is otherwise very, very close to stabilizing worldwide, and in doing that, you ultimately increase the world's carbon footprint and, much more seriously, its wider environmental footprint of humankind. So exactly the wrong policies were being advocated at Copenhagen, and I think the growing realization on the part of the admittedly rather small number of people in the world's bureaucratic class who are sane and well educated on this issue, there were enough of them to start saying to the others, look, we're just not going to go down this route of enforced population control, of enforced control over CO2 emissions. That's the wrong way. That will have perverse effects, not the least of which will be to imprison large parts of the world in a poverty from which they are only just beginning to lift themselves, and that would be cruelty of the most unspeakable kind.
I couldn't agree more. I heard you say in one of your interviews, you talked about Greenpeace and how your friends started that up. And since we're on the subject of Marxism, a political idea that I think is the most murderous in history, you said that it was started by your friends and out of a real concern for the environment. Explain why those people left, and who and what is now controlling these organizations.
Right. Well, I can certainly tell you who it was that told me this. It was Eric Ellington, who's a good friend of ours, who was one of the original founders of Greenpeace, together with Patrick Moore, who has publicly said what Eric Ellington has said to me privately, which is that they joined it, they set it up, they created this organization because they genuinely thought it would be a good idea to protect the environment against excesses of overdevelopment and insensitive wrecking of landscapes and encroachment on vulnerable habitats of both flora and fauna. And so they set up this organization with very worthy, very sensible environmental aims to which everybody would subscribe. But in no time at all, within a year or two, this organization of Greenpeace had been taken over by Marxists. And that was the word that Eric Ellington unhesitatingly used. He said these were Marxists, they had an agenda which had nothing whatever to do with protecting the environment and everything to do with destroying the West from within. And he said, we all left, and Patrick Moore, who was, again, another founder of Greenpeace, says the same. He said, we all left because we realized that the organization we had created was no longer under our control. It was under the control of forces that were very well funded, controlled from countries deeply hostile to the West, and, of course, poisonously hostile, as we know all communist countries are, to any sort of reasonable environmental management. You only have to go to a typical communist country like China to see the filth in the air and the dirt everywhere. That always goes with communism, it seems. Nevertheless, these Marxists decided they would exploit cynically Greenpeace and other similar organizations for fell political ends that had everything to do with trying to persuade the West to shut its own economy down from within than to protect the environment. Why do they want to shut the economies of the West down, you might say? You might say, well, surely they want to trade with us. No, they don't. What they want is to get access to the valuable and finite natural resources around the world, for which at the moment we can compete and we can pay higher prices than they can. If they can get us to destroy our economies from within, they can get access and exclusive access to those natural resources and cut us out. And while our leaders like ostriches have their heads in the sand talking about climate change that isn't going to happen, here are the Chinese, for instance, going around doing huge bilateral deals They've just done one in Gabon to secure the world's largest deposits of iron ore for their steel industry. That's now closed to the rest of the world. It's exclusively for China. They've just done a deal with the Kurds in northern Iraq, got the approval of the main Iraqi government, and they rented a rickety drilling rig and began drilling for oil, and their very first hole, they found 1 trillion barrels of oil, and that is now Chinese oil. They're doing this all over the world, while we are busily shutting down our industries in the name of climate change. And the Chinese, therefore, were not prepared at Copenhagen to make any concessions whatsoever to President Obama. He went there and had a 55-minute meeting with Wen Jiabao, who is the Chinese head of the Council of State, the equivalent of a prime minister in a communist country. And Obama got nowhere with him. And it was quite clear from Jiabao's speech afterwards that he wasn't having anything of what Obama had said to him about having verifiable and binding cuts in carbon emissions. And indeed, I have a lot of sympathy with China on this one, because if you are trying to lift your people from poverty, and to some extent they are really trying to do that now, then the last thing you want to do is to have some stupid Western country come whining to you about climate change and tell you you can't use fossil fuels to generate electricity, when alone it's electricity that'll provide transport and industry and hospitals and X-rays and elevators for tower blocks and all the other things you need electricity for. Without electricity, you can't have prosperity. Without prosperity, you can't have a stable population. So China is quite right to say that she is not prepared to suffer any cuts whatsoever in her own emissions. She's offered to try to make sure by using new technologies that she will emit as little as possible, but she's not going to place any limits on it, and rightly not. And it was that refusal by China to bend to the will of the Marxists in the West that led to the breakdown of the talks in Copenhagen. Once it was clear that China meant business by saying it was not going to play, and China had quite rightly got into bed with South Africa and Brazil to say the same. They got together and they said, we're not going to do it. India was the fourth in that. There was South Africa, India, and Brazil and China. They presented a common front and a very clear front at the Copenhagen talks. They said, we are not going to be told that we can't emit CO2 while the West is emitting it quite freely and clearly isn't actually going to make any significant reduction. And those countries were quite right to take that cynical line, but they would have been still more right if they had accepted, as a growing number of scientists now do, and in fact it's now, I think, a clear majority of scientists around the world accept, that the UN has exaggerated the effect of CO2 on temperature, and we therefore don't need any of these controls on CO2. We don't, in fact, need the Mexico conference next year. People could stay at home, reduce their carbon footprint, and just not go. The time for all this nonsense is over. People have seen through it now, particularly in those countries where we are fortunate enough to be able to elect and remove our governments. And our governments have to listen to us, the people, on this. The people are no longer buying the great lie about the climate. And once the people have decided they're not buying it, it's only a matter of time before the wiser elected politicians realize they'd better follow the line or find themselves flung out of office.
I completely agree with you, sir. On our show last Sunday night, I attested that the Copenhagen puppet masters got exactly what they wanted behind the paradigm curtain. Lord Monckton, would you speculate what the next climate fraud conference will bring, and is climate change a religion?
No, it's not a religion, it's a superstition. It has no truth in it. At least a religion aims to have truth in it. Nobody who has been peddling this climate nonsense, from among these ClimateGate scientists, none of them was concerned with the truth at all. They were concerned with creating, effectively, a new superstition. And it's just as bad as throwing a pinch of salt over your shoulder, or not walking over the cracks in the pavement, or not walking under a ladder. It is as childish, as stupid, and as scientifically baseless as that kind of superstition. So no, it certainly isn't a religion. It is a superstition. It certainly isn't scientific. It owes nothing whatsoever to science. That is becoming blindingly clear to everyone who takes the trouble to look even just a little bit below the surface of the science. So what do I think will happen next? That was the first part of your question, to which I will now turn. I think that the first thing that's going to happen is that there are really two countries, for different reasons, whose attitude to this will dominate what can and can't be done by the forces of darkness who are trying to impose world government on us in the name of climate change. And the two countries concerned are China, which we've already talked about, and the United States of America. And the reason why America is